Social or demonic sin often brings up the question of blame. Like, whose fault is it? Whose fault is sin? It's an interesting question because it's not necessarily really a biblical question. And it really, I think, kind of betrays a little bit of our sort of very penal substitutionary way of thinking about sin. We got to figure out whose fault it is so we know who needs to be forgiven, kind of thing. It's interesting if you look at the Old Testament law. One of the interesting things about the sacrificial system is there's lots of different kinds of sacrifice, and not all of them, even the ones addressing sin, are really trying to address blame so much as they're trying to make something clean, which is a really interesting notion. If you look at some of the different rituals, like one involves one of the rituals that goes on quite a bit is it involves spattering blood of the animals on various objects or persons or clothing, vestments, in order to make that person or those animals or whatever clean, or people clean. The idea being that as you're going about in the world, you're getting sullied by uncleanness, ritual uncleanness, unholiness, the impurities of the world. Through no fault of your own. It's just kind of what happens. So, for example, if your brother dies and you carry the corpse, some of the corpse's uncleanness, the ritual impurity, gets off on you. And as a result, you need to be clean from that. And so, interestingly, the spackling of blood in some of these rituals is much like kind of a spiritual 409, like a cleaner that gets. Notice that what's going on there. This is literally something that happens in the Old Testament. It's not. I'm not making this up. It's Levitical law. It's not about blame. The sin it's sin, but it's not about being guilty of anything. It's about being impure. It's about being out of sync with the way that God has reality set up. It means having been a part of something that wasn't the way it's supposed to be. It's just something that has to get wiped off. It's not something where you have to say, I'm sorry, I messed up. It's not that at all. It's just this needs to be fixed. It needs to be straightened. This crooked path needs to be made straight. And so, spiritual 409. Similarly, when we're talking about social sin and even sin that's demonically influenced, if we're asking whose fault is it, we're asking the wrong question, because this is the kind of sin that is not meant. It's really probably not addressed by penal substitutionary atonement. It's not the kind of sin that's addressed that way. Sin's bigger than we thought. Maybe if we were really heavily invested in notions of individual guilt, it's bigger than that, and the solution is bigger than that. So what we want is not the sense of, okay, here's this corrupt, evil, corporation. Whose fault is it? Give me the head of the CEO or whatever. Like, that's not the way we go about it. Rather, what we say is, how do we how do we get spiritual 409 and purify this organization, this institution, this society, this community? How do we make it right again? Not who's the ringleader here who brought all this, because that's not how social sin works. There are often ringleaders. There are often people who are more responsible than others. But at the end of the day, social sin is not something that you can just find a scapegoat and pin it on them. Although interestingly, depending on how you read the scapegoating text in the Old Testament, it might be something like that, where the community recognizes that the community as a whole is just not right, and say, let all that impurity go on the scapegoat and send the scapegoat out of here, symbolizing, ritualizing the purification of an entire people rather than an individual. So it could be, depending on how you read that, it could be that scapegoating itself is an attempt to deal with social sin. If that's an idea that interests you, René Girard, a French theorist, and some of his followers in the English-speaking world have tried to develop this notion that that even scapegoating, the very idea of murdering one to push off all the sins of the other, that itself is something that's in the scriptures and is something that Jesus' sacrifice, Jesus' crucifixion, is meant to address once and for all. That's just an idea. The bottom line is, we're not called to look for the fault in every situation. There's probably plenty of blame to go around. Rather, we're supposed to look at how is this addressed by the cross. How does this get fixed? How do we clean this up? How do we purify this situation, this community, this institution? this people, this group, this family, whatever it is. It, let's not ignore the fact that people hold responsibility and moral agency. That's not helpful either. But let's not reduce the problem to individual moral agency. Because once we've done that, it's just like the fishbowl thing again. You take this one fish out, you get this fish clean, and you throw it back in the fishbowl, and then when it gets dirty and gross and messed up again, what, we're going to blame the fish? I mean, the fish was great. We got it in the clean bowl. We got it all cleaned up. Self-destructive behavior is gone. We drop it back in the same exact environment, and we get the same exact result. We shouldn't be surprised by this, and we shouldn't just look at the person with the self-destructive and be like, your fault. That is not a helpful way forward. Rather, we look at the whole system, the whole community, and say, hey, how can this entire environment be cleansed so that we can have the best outcomes going forward?